are so well behaved. The hush fell over the crowd. Excuse me. Hopefully I make it through without too much coughing. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's community briefing, sponsored by the Johnson Foundation at Wingspread and the MacArthur Foundation. I want to thank our two presenters, the MacArthur Foundation, their staff, and the Johnson Foundation staff, all who have made tonight possible. And most of all, I want to thank all of you for being here with us tonight. Tonight's briefing provides an opportunity for us to learn from two of the country's leading thinkers and innovators. Both presenters are MacArthur Fellows, which means they're part of an exceptional group of individuals whose creative pursuits land them a no-strings-attached financial award from the MacArthur Foundation as a recognition of their work and an investment in their potential. The Johnson and MacArthur Foundations have partnered over the last 15 years to bring a subset of fellows together to share ideas and build relationships that may inspire collaboration into the future. Tonight marks the third year that we've had the privilege to partner with two special MacArthur Fellows to share their unique perspectives with our local community. This year's ingenious presentations reflect the spirit of innovation and collaboration that are essential to creating resilient communities, something of great importance to the Johnson Foundation and many of you. Both presentations have relevance in our neighborhood of communities and our collective ability to create a future where all citizens in our region thrive. It's my hope that all of you can take something away tonight, a new piece of information, a new contact or connection, and possibly even an idea that you may consider integrating or applying into your own personal or professional life. With that being said, I'd like to hand it off to Christina Lovely, Senior Program Officer in the MacArthur Fellows Program at the MacArthur Foundation, to introduce our first featured presenter. Please join me in welcoming Christina.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you all for being here. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to introduce Betsy and Damon, which, despite knowing a lot about them because of our research as part of our confidential program, this is the first time I'm meeting them in person, so it's exciting for me too. I'd like to say just a few words about the MacArthur Fellows Program and what it means to be named a MacArthur Fellow. There are three criteria for selection of fellows: exceptional creativity, a track record of accomplishment, and the potential for the fellowship to facilitate future work. As Ashley mentioned, recipients receive a stipend, now set at $625,000 paid over 5 years, and there are no strings attached. We do not ask them what they do with it, and they can use it in any way they see fit. We believe that creative individuals know best how to use the funds and the recognition that comes with the fellowship to engender new work. Since 1981, nearly 1,000 individuals from all areas of human endeavor have been named fellows. One of the many amazing and inspiring aspects of the fellowship we have found are the unexpected connections among fellows' work and the creative solutions and thinking that comes naturally when we bring fellows together. And that's something we're very grateful to the Johnson Foundation for helping us to facilitate. Although Betsy and Damon come from very different fields, they are both enriching our understanding of what community means today. From the social dynamics that contribute to group and individual behavior, to the democratization of public spaces and opaque bureaucratic systems that shape our built environments. Betsy and Damon provide unique perspectives on how communities are created and sustained, how they can be made inclusive and responsive to the needs of all, and how they can be mobilized to overcome entrenched norms and engender change. We'll begin today with Betsy Pollock. Betsy is a professor of psychology and public affairs at Princeton University, where she is also the deputy director of the Kahneman Treisman Center for Behavioral Science and Policy. Through innovative field-based experiments in real-world interventions in settings ranging from post-conflict Rwanda to American high schools, Betsy is unraveling the interplay between social norms and individual behavior. She has identified strategies for reducing patterns of discrimination, bullying, and ethnic conflict, and levers for positively influencing individual and group behavior.
But I'm very lucky. I'm very lucky that one of the criteria for being a MacArthur Fellow is not athletic ability. All right, I can get settled here. There. Great. Okay. I've learned my lesson not to play in any more faculty graduate student softball games. Even when the professors win, we also lose. So I'm really honored to come and speak to you today. As Chris said, I have dedicated my career so far to trying to understand human behavior and behavior change when we're trying to motivate different kinds of behavior for positive social change. And it's brought me to study social norms. And in order to tell you about what I mean by a social norm, it's a term that is getting a lot of use these days. I like to start with this little toy example. And in order to give this example, just with a show of hands, can you tell me how many of you are here for the first time to this gathering? Okay, great. So you may be sitting in the audience right now, even if you've been here before, thinking, can I ask questions during this presentation? And what I want to propose is the way you're going to try to figure that out is very similar to what I'm going to talk to you about today. You might look around at other people and see if anyone else is raising their hand. If someone does raise their hand to ask a question, you might notice whether others look at them disapprovingly or nod and get excited. In my field where I come from, psychology, we don't usually ask questions, although the economists down the street don't usually let you say anything without asking a question first. And so we all have our own norms of even presentation rooms, right? So we can grow these norms, and we try to figure them out by looking around at other people and noticing what's common and noticing what's considered desirable. And what I want to argue to you today is that you may even use the same kind of process to ask this question of yourself. So, do I participate in violence? Okay, and so that's sort of the argument I'm going to make to you today, and I'll tell you about how I got to this place in my work thinking this way. So first, just a brief, formal definition. Psychologists think about social norms as perceptions. Perceptions of what's currently typical or desirable, or even perceptions of where this is going in your community. And so an example of a norm perception outside of violence and asking questions in a presentation, and I should say, please feel free to ask a question if anywhere along the way I say something odd or confusing. A formal example of something like this would be most Americans support same-sex marriage. That's what we would think of as a perception of a norm. It's your perception. There's probably some objective truth out there, but it's very hard to measure. And what's most important is that this is your idea of what's normative, okay? And I can contrast that with something that we would call more of a personal attitude. I support same-sex marriage. A distinction that I want to also draw here is that when a lot of people go out into the world to try to change behavior, they often try to change people's personal attitudes. You may have heard of it as changing hearts and minds and so forth. And people in my field have been involved in those efforts for a long time. Not a lot of people go out to try to change normative perceptions, change your perceptions about what other people are doing and thinking. And that's sort of where our work has come in, the work of me and my colleagues. And it's important because norms aren't these free-floating things that belong to all of us. They belong to groups. They belong to communities. And so that's why different communities have different norms. We're going to generate a set of norms even as we interact here in this room about how we interact with one another. And I came about these ideas pretty honestly, by which I mean I didn't set out to study it just because I was interested in social norms. As a graduate student, I went to Rwanda. I was interested in studying this post-genocide reconciliation radio soap opera, which was a challenge to explain to my folks back home about what I was using my PhD to do. But the idea here was that radio was considered to be a driver of the horrific violence that happened during the 1994 genocide. And the question was, can we turn that on its head and use it to build peace in the aftermath, peace and reconciliation? And in order to do this, they designed a soap opera that was a typical soap opera that you might hear all over the world. It was full of love and villainy and drama. And it featured characters that were designed to be very much like people who Rwandans met in their local communities. They were designed to be representative of your neighbors. And they went through a plot where that very much mirrored what had happened in Rwanda. There was a Romeo and Juliet character from different villages, and when authorities tried to foment violence between the two villages, fortunately for this show, Romeo and Juliet didn't die. They started a youth peace movement, and the plot went on from there. And my job as a graduate student, I was trying to study the impact of this radio program. And without getting into any of the details, this is a scene that they're recording in the studio in Kigali. What we found at the end of studying people who had been listening to this program for a year versus people who were exposed to a different kind of radio soap opera, we found that their perceptions of norms did change, but not their personal attitudes. And to give you an example of what I mean, intermarriage was a very big theme of the show because of this Romeo and Juliet plotline. People would tell us things like, I really don't believe that intermarriage brings peace. I just lived through this war and genocide where Hutu husbands killed their Tutsi wives. But on the other hand, I do believe that Rwandans are intermarrying now, and I should support that. I should allow my children to marry someone from the other ethnic group. And I thought that this was notable because we also noticed that behavior changed among the people who had been listening to this program. When we involved them in challenges to divide up goods in their communities, they did it in a spirited but also more egalitarian way. And so to me, that's what mattered, is that if norms are changing alongside behaviors, maybe we should be paying attention to what people perceive as normal rather than what they truly think in their hearts and minds, at least for now. What was really interesting about this finding was that it seemed to accord with what people were talking about in terms of patterns of behavior during the genocide, and in particular, what drove the violence. And so people talked about how they didn't have particular animus or hatred toward their neighbors, but once the genocide started, once the violence started, they would use evocative phrases like, it felt like rain, it felt like the law. Everyone was doing it, you felt like you had to join. And so they were really painting an account of the violence as normative, rather than something driven by a personal belief. Some research even backed that up, showing that the media might have been a driver of this. So you see that black line going dramatically up. Those are the communities where more people were exposed to the radio broadcast. Some people are cut off from radio broadcasts in Rwanda, which is an extremely hilly country. So you can track collective violence as spiking in places where people were aware that everyone else in their community was getting the same message from this hate radio program that was playing throughout the genocide. Psychologists have been thinking about social norms for a long time, and we have some classic studies maybe of interest to you here, because I know the Johnson Foundation is really very involved in environmental efforts. One classic study from my field shows that just informing people of what others are doing can change their behavior. So in this particular study, this is a door knocker that you hang on people's bathroom doors in hotels, and what the famous psychologist Cialdini and his colleagues showed is that this led to much more reuse of towels when you inform people that it's the norm, basically. Other people in this hotel are reusing their towels. It's not a silver bullet, but it seems to move behavior, informing other people what others are doing rather than trying to change their attitudes about it. And this has become so popular and so well known for those of you who are paying attention to behavioral economics or behavioral science that it's a very popular idea. And so recently I noticed on Twitter, scientists were discussing how there was an asteroid headed in the direction of Earth. And so one scientist quipped, well, most asteroids do avoid Earth, so plenty of social norming potential here. To which the Nobel Prize-winning behavioral scientist replied to her, well, excellent, text all asteroids. 99.9% of all asteroids have bypassed Earth. And this is great. I think it gets us somewhere. But also, as a psychologist interested in social change, I see some social problems kind of like asteroids. We're probably not going to move an asteroid by texting it and telling it what other asteroids do. And not all behaviors are like reusing towels, right? So I've really been focused on this question of, well, what are other ways to maybe contribute to changes in social norms and thus changes in behavior? And the way we've translated this question, who has a say in setting these community norms, we think of it, as psychologists, as who are we paying attention to when we're trying to figure out what the norms are, right? And so to go back to my earlier little toy example, when you're trying to figure out whether or not to ask me a question, you might not look around at everyone in the room. You might look at Ashley, our fearless leader, who just opened up things to see if she's asking questions, right? You might pay attention to certain signs and signals in people, right? And so this is what we've really been after in my research lately. Sorry for all the text, but this is just a slide to tell you that we've thought about what are the cues to social norms in 3 different ways. So one way might be this summary information, like the door knocker or the text from a Nobel Prize-winning economist about what you should do. But the other 2 ways we've been studying it, and this is what I'll tell you about in the time I have remaining, is the public behavior of your community members and who that is, and then institutional communications, coming from institutions like courts or schools, et cetera. So I'm going to tell you about a few studies that we've been using to try to really understand how to shape social norms and behavior. So first, the public behavior of group members. We've been doing a lot of this work in schools. And the basic idea here, as I've just sort of previewed for you, is that as students are looking around in their school trying to figure out what's normal, what's the norm here, how should I behave, not just how should I fit in, but also how can I not stick out, which is a big concern for all of us, not just adolescents. They're all embedded in social networks, and so they're not taking this unweighted average of what everyone is doing. They're looking to certain people. Some people get overweighted when they're trying to figure out this norm. And so this is an actual high school where we went in and did a social network survey with them. And all of the students in this high school are colored gray. Their relationships are represented by the black arrows. And the way we figured out how to draw those arrows was that we asked everyone in the school to fill out a survey where we said, name the people who you chose to spend time with in the last 2 weeks, either face-to-face or online. So this is almost a social network of attention, right? If you can think about it that way. And in this network of attention, the yellow people are special people. They're people who we call social reference. So they're the people to whom you refer as you're thinking about social norms. And they could look like this. They could look like this person here on the left, who we call her a widely known. We don't call her popular. She might not actually be well-liked, but a lot of people are paying attention to her, right? So many that they might not all even know each other. On the right, there's a clique leader, sort of self-explanatory, usually smaller groups of people paying attention to them. And the point here is that we were really trying to use this method to try to understand who are the influentials. We all have an intuition about who they are, but could this method open up people for us who we don't normally think of as influentials, who are actually being overweighted as you think about who are the norms? And can we change their behavior, essentially, and in doing so, change the norms of the school? So I'm going to see if I can open this for you now. Oh. Yes, open, please. So after that initial foray in one high school that I just showed you, we worked with the New Jersey public school system, and we did an experiment in 56 different middle schools. And we went in at the beginning of the year, we measured their social networks, we found out who were these social reference. In some cases, they were surprising to the principals when we would bring them the list of names. They would say, you know, this can't be true. These are not the influential students. So it really did call up students who were not necessarily well known to teachers, but well known to students. And our goal here was actually to try to change norms of conflict in bullying. And our strategy was, can we involve groups of students, small groups of students at each school, and can we test whether it is actually the case that when you encourage these influential students to speak out, you're really going to have this this network level change on the perceived norms and actual behavior at the school. So our strategy was guided by a program that we designed. It was called the Roots program, for no other reason than we focus grouped it and students were least able to make fun of this particular name. So we were very proud of ducking that. And the program was really almost content-free. Basically, if I could describe it to you in a sentence, it was we were their campaign managers and they were the politicians. We gave them a broad umbrella issue. We said, we want to make your school a better place to be, make people less anxious to come to school every day. To you, what does that mean? And so we asked these students, we took a random draw of students at each school. So we had varying proportions of influentials and non-influentials at each school. We were going to use that as a way to test whether the influentials were actually important to getting these norms to change. And we took them through this year-long program where we really asked for their input, and then we helped them. We gave them, in-person templates to try to change messaging around their schools that they designed. So they designed these hashtag campaigns that were both online and in person, and we really tried to get the word out. These are the people who are behind this. It's not us, it's not the adults. So they would do things like sign their names to posters on the wall and put things on their social media feeds. They did wristband campaigns where they would hand out wristbands with their messages to their peers. So the intervention really varied from school to school, but the same strategy was in place at the schools. They were all using this particular program, except for a control group of schools who we didn't touch. We just measured the conflict and the norms that were there. So basically, I'll just tell you the findings, and to orient you to this graph. On the y-axis here, we got the disciplinary reports from every single school. Essentially, how many times during the year every student was dragged to the office or suspended or expelled for peer conflict. And we looked on the x-axis here. What this means is this is the proportion of the students at each school who were participating in this anti-conflict group, who were social reference, right? So I told you that it varied from the school to school. What this graph is telling you is that in the schools where they did our program, in these treatment schools, you see that conflict was significantly reduced the more we involved these social reference. We also find that they change the social norms more. So you see the norms are improving as people are exposed to more and more social reference. So you see this sort of network change in terms of how students are thinking about their school, and they're being influenced by these sort of highly influential students. So that was in the middle schools. I'm going to take a brief stop here to tell you about one study. We're going to fly to Nigeria for a second. I've maintained my interest in media, and Nigeria's media industry is a phenomenal one. It's the third largest media industry in the world. So it goes Hollywood, Bollywood, and then Nollywood for Nigeria. We worked there to try to have a more focused test of what I was telling you about in Rwanda, where I was telling you about these characters that seemed like your neighbors. The idea really is, can fictional characters even be reference for us? Can they change our ideas about what's normative? In Nigeria, we were trying to involve people in a collective action effort to report corruption in their communities. There's a lot of apathy around this for good reason. And without going into the details, what we did is we worked with a production company in Nigeria to produce a new movie, and it had a corruption storyline. It was a story of these two brothers. One was a fisherman, one rose to prominence as a politician, so lots of great family tension. And the common fisherman started an anti-corruption campaign, and he encouraged people to start reporting corruption via this texting hotline, which we then set up in real life with a Nigerian activist group. What we then observed, we produced this movie, and we produced one version without the scenes of these characters reporting corruption via text. So everyone can watch the movie, but only some people are exposed to the role models, these influential media characters who are designed to be a lot like them. And we simply observed, are we getting more texts from people? So this first graph The blue line represents all of the places where the movie was played with our media role models. And the red line is all of the places where the movie was played without it. And you see that both places, people are sending in text messages. Everyone had access to the texting hotline. And basically you see that the movie is doing its job. It's advertising this hotline. What engaged messages mean is that people were sending in texts like, is this on? Like, what is this? So sending in text messages but not reporting corruption. If you actually look to see who sent in messages about corruption, it was only the places, mostly, where we had the movie with these characters who were also doing this, right? I don't think this is about sheer imitation. I think this is about giving people access to models of people like themselves, and making them think of this behavior as something that's actually more typical than they thought before. Okay. Do I have time for a final? Okay, great. So I have one more study for you today, and I promised you I would tell you about social norms in institutions. A recent study that I did with a graduate student is about the Supreme Court. So we were interested in studying a national institution. So now we're thinking about norms on a national level. And people's responses to institutions that are fairly well liked. So the Supreme Court actually fits that, that requirement. The Supreme Court is continuously getting pretty high public approval ratings, especially compared to Congress and other national institutions of ours. What we were interested in this study, we knew that the decision Obergefell v. Hodges was about to come up, which was the decision on same-sex marriage. And what we were interested to know was not whether the Supreme Court, again, was going to change people's hearts and minds, convince them to support same-sex marriage more or less, but rather, would it change your idea about what other Americans think, okay? And why would it do that? Well, institutions that are thought of as fairly representative of the community might have the potential to change what we think is desirable and typical in the community. Maybe because we think that institutions are reacting to us. They're making decisions that reflect our values. It could also be that we think of these institutions as experts, and so they're sort of showing us where we're going in the future, and we have some trust in them. And then also, many institutions are highly visible. So the kinds of decisions they make and the rules they set, the punishments or the communications they send out are highly discussed by people in the community. And this is also an opportunity to change norms because you can see the way people are reacting and you can observe their public behavior in that way. So we did a simple survey in which we gathered together a sample of people online, and we just kept asking them the same questions every couple of weeks or so. Just a couple questions. Two were about norms. We asked about norms in two ways. One, in terms of the status quo right now. To what extent do you think Americans oppose or support gay marriage? And then one about the future. In the future, will this increase or decrease? And then we were interested in contrasting their perceptions of norms to personal attitudes. So to what extent do you personally oppose or support? We use something that psychologists use called the feeling thermometer. Just how warm do you feel toward people who are gay? And this is what we found. So the black line in these graphs is the day of the Supreme Court decision. And on top here, you see what people are saying about social norms. And the increase, this dramatic increase you see here, which is about a point on a scale, which may seem small to you, but to someone studying public opinion is a huge jump, and probably some of you do study public opinion. So basically, the day that the decision was announced, and in the days following, and in the weeks following even, people were more likely to think that Americans support same-sex marriage after hearing about the decision. Whereas you see a completely flat line in terms of their own personal opinions and their own feelings of warmth toward gay people. One thing that I think was really interesting about this study, besides this split between how we personally feel and where we think our community is, we found the same thing for self-identified liberals and conservatives. So you'll see different levels of support here. Here are the liberals, here are the conservatives. But you see the jump in both cases. So clearly what we're observing is an institution that everyone believes in to a certain extent and thinks is signaling something about who we are as a nation, as a community. We didn't measure any behavior in this study, but I still think that these findings are important. I'm not sure if it related to the ways in which people treated or thought about same-sex couples who they knew in their community. But we're now building up a lot of evidence that our perceptions of where we think our community is and what our community values really does have a big impact on our behavior, maybe sometimes even a bigger impact than how we personally feel. Okay, so I'll end here by saying I really think that social norms matter, and I think we're developing a science to understand who has a say in them, that is, who's shaping the social norms of our community, and I hope that it allows us as organizations, as teachers, and as community members to try to shape them in positive ways. So, first of all, community members, so the social reference in particular. And what I want to say here, when I say what are their priorities, I want to note that what we have always tried to do is not try to tell people in the community what to communicate about their values, but rather to invite them, to bring them in and to express where they think that the community should go. And we think that this has to do with the influence that we've seen in these studies. We've seen that collaboration works. So one thing a point that I want to be very clear about is in none of our middle schools did we only use social reference, the super influencers. They were always collaborating with other students, and we still saw this positive effect. So I think that that's also a promising message, that we don't only need to go after the super communicators and those who are getting the most attention. It is possible to do it in collaboration. And then finally, we can find social reference, these highly influential people, we can place them in stories. So I'm very interested in how we can use media and storytelling and narrative in our communities as well to try to change our perceptions of what's normal and our ultimate behavior. And then finally, institutions have a role to play here. We've only studied the institutions so far that people think of as representative and legitimate. And I think the story would be different if we felt as though this institution didn't represent our community. And I would encourage you too, though, to think about the interactions among all of these factors, institutions, people, media. Certainly it's the case that when the Supreme Court announced their decision, not only did people hear about the decision, but they saw, lots of people described, my Facebook page was exploding in rainbows. And so they were also seeing social reference in their own communities, reacting positively, sometimes reacting negatively. There are lots of interactions among these different influencers, these cues to what's normal. And I think I'll end on that.
Damon Rich is co-founder and partner of Hector Design Service. He's a designer and urban planner who enables residents to exercise power within the public and private processes that shape our cities. Through design of public spaces, art exhibits, and civics curricula, Damon celebrates the inclusion and vision of communities and residents who are often excluded from the urban planning process. He was founder and president of the Center for Urban Pedagogy from 1997 to 2007. And he served as Director of Planning for the City of Newark, New Jersey from 2008 to 2015.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Nice to see you all here. It is really great to be with a group of people who are willing to take the time to talk about Greater Racine, and I think therefore care that much about it, or at least, I guess, who are willing to sit here politely until the hospitality section. So thanks to both Ashleys and the Johnson Foundation for inviting and getting me here. amazing to hear Betsy. I want to change my whole presentation, but I guess it's too late now. And it's been great to learn a little bit about some of the discussions going on in Greater Racine over the last year about resilient communities. As a designer and a planner, I am always very grateful for any group of people that talks about the importance of regions and the importance of bringing diverse collaborations together. I'll also say it's fun to be here because in this Wright building, it's a pretty wild Wright building where I've never been before, because just last summer, my firm Hector was invited by the Museum of Modern Art in New York City to make kind of a cover version of this old Frank Lloyd Wright project called Broadacre City. Has anybody ever come across that? A couple people? This was this kind of scheme, futuristic proto-suburb that Wright and his collaborators cooked up in the 1930s. If you went there, you might see these like drones and cars and highways and big fairgrounds and at least 1 acre of land for every family, and that's kind of where the name came from. And so the museum said, well, we're having this Wright exhibition, and we want to try to find some way to bring these weird ideas from the 1930s somehow alive to a contemporary audience. And so one of the things we focused on, of course, because I knew Betsy was going to talk about this, was around the exclusion that was really a part of Wright's scheme. And so if you go back and read about it, there's these giant lists of no's that accompany Broadacre City. There's no smoke, no wires, no bureaucrats, no slums, no scum. And so what we wanted to do was kind of liberate this power of negativity within the constraints of the museum. And so both some of the things that Wright had banished were welcomed back in, like the wires, but also some things that had not existed at the time, like self-driving cars or Pokemon hunting, if anyone here is into that. Also, unlike Wright's model, where everything was glued down, here visitors were really asked to build the landscape through landscapes and then have the organic architecture kind of grow out of that so they could come and really represent their own vision or alter or completely obliterate the visions of people that had gone before them. So over time, this landscape kind of evolved. I'm wondering, if it's not too much trouble, do you think we can go full screen with the images, just so you're not looking at the Microsoft things? And sometimes choreograph these pretty funny interactions, like when this environmental activist threatened to file a lawsuit against this scheming real estate developer. And so, in the end, though it was kind of a playtime, a workshop inside a museum, so even these very harsh conflicts were quickly resolved to hopefully result in new ideas about what a city could be in the 21st century, just how Broadacre City was involved in that discussion for the 20th. Although hopefully a little bit more open about some of the conflicts and cooperation that was necessary for its making. So tonight, knowing that y'all have been talking about resilience, I wanted to share a couple thoughts about the idea of going beyond resilience and what that might mean. And especially, just like with Broadacre City, this challenge of working openly around relationships of power. Because I have friends who are like, oh yeah, you urban planners, you're always talking about sustainability, but sustain what? Sustain business as usual? Sustain the existing system of privileges and power? So these kinds of questions, whether they're sustainability or resilience, are oftentimes very quickly connected to larger questions of power and self-determination. So I'd also like to talk about going beyond resilience in a way that I think you're familiar with, because resilience is not really a ribbon-cutting event where all of a sudden you're like, all right, we're resilient, cut the ribbon. Now, I've worked for real estate developers and mayors, and I know that these parties with big scissors or the golden shovels that you sometimes use are really important, right? Not just to politics, but to economies. But I don't think that they're fully adequate representations of what it means for a community to talk to itself about what it wants to be. So part of beyond resilience might mean to go beyond focusing on an end state to a process of accountable development. How are we setting up networks of accountability to kind of keep this thing going? And a third and final sense of beyond resilience is to go beyond just the before and the after. Or another way to think about it is, resilience is a word that you might oftentimes find next to like a bullet point in like a planning report. And if your question is the same as mine, because as I'll tell you, I'm from Missouri, which is the show me state, I'm like, how does that abstract idea, like out there, up there, translate into anything that I might see when I'm walking around every day, that I might look at and touch and actually experience? As a designer, I really see part of our work as making those material translations from our values and our concepts into the real patterns that we live and work by every single day, from concept to material. Now, those relationships between concept and material through design are not always obvious. So for example, I grew up in the post-war suburbs of St. Louis, Missouri, a place called Creve Coeur, which, unlike most suburbs, doesn't have a happy name, like something estates. It means broken heart. It's the weird way we say that in Missouri. And although growing up there gave me a lot of advantages and excellent public schools, it really allowed me to remain ignorant, in kind of a sanctioned ignorance, about certain very fundamental questions. Things like how did the suburb I grew up in end up with 90% of people who mark the white box on the census, right? That was not a natural phenomenon. That was a result of real decisions. How does space in our country become racialized around these questions of power and identity? And so I realized, pretty soon into my career as a planner and an urban designer that I had some learning to do, right? And thank goodness I've met a lot of people along the way willing to pull my jacket and to instruct me in some of the things that my otherwise excellent childhood environment really left me lacking. Because, different than, say, the fast violence of getting punched or getting cut, the kind of violence that exists in these landscapes is a much slower kind of violence. But indeed, it is written into the landscape. And so as soon as we're talking about a region or working together or governments coming together or people going across boundaries, we are very much talking about these existing structures that come out of this history. And I think that if we try to ignore that, we don't really do ourselves a service. And so the kind of work that we do at our firm Hector, we really do our best to keep these questions of power, authority, and decision-making front and center. Because we think that without doing that, they will still be there, but not be dealt with in a very straightforward way. And in doing this, we're not reinventing the wheel. This is part of a really long tradition in our country, where we've had, and this is simplifying it a little bit, but a pretty basic problematic. Where on one hand, we think of our country as a place that really values private property. It's your stuff. You get to do with your stuff with what you want. At the same time, we think of our country as a place that's a democracy, right? Where if you're a person, no matter how much money you have or how you worship or what you do, you have some kind of say in the things that we do together. And one way to think about the history of urban planning is trying to somehow split this difference. Because up until a certain point, just about 100 years ago, if you were a wealthy person who owned a lot of land, you pretty much could do what you wanted with it. But as people started living closer together, that became kind of an issue. And so if you were living and enjoying where you lived one day and the next day there was like a pig slaughterhouse next door, that was not such a great outcome. So, if you think about things like the first building codes, 100 years ago, that the government would ever make a rule, for how you were going to build a building that you were going to rent out to a tenant. Or about, 10 or 20 years after that, the first zoning laws, when all of a sudden the government was involved in making rules for how you use your land that you owned free and clear. And if you're familiar with this history, these were not easy decisions. These things went to the Supreme Court because, people who had been making their own decisions about their own land for a long time said, I don't think that's what I want, like more rules for what I can do. And so this history led to places like planning offices, where I worked in the city where I live for 7 years. Has anyone here ever had the joy of dealing with a planning office or a zoning board or something like that? A couple knowing smiles and maybe not quite straightforward expressions. And this really was the place where if you wanted to build something in the town, you had to make a drawing of it, you had to drop it off or put it on the website, and people who supported you could look at it and come up with all the reasons they thought this was the most beautiful thing. And the neighbors that didn't like your idea could look at it as well and show up before a publicly appointed body and say all the reasons that you shouldn't be allowed to build that thing. And this is also the history that produced the very basic mechanisms that we use today that in theory connect the questions of democracy to the decisions about how we build. Things like code enforcement, things like public hearings, things like environmental impact statements, right? You might be familiar with some of these kinds of things. But again, those of you who have experience know that sometimes there's signs that the system isn't totally working. So you might go to a planning board hearing and there might not be much public there, right? Or, maybe worse, the community meeting turns chaotic. So when seeing these kind of failures or frictions in these systems that are now 50 years old or so about how to make decisions together, about the things that we have to share, one very nerdy thing that I return to is drawn here. This was a design never built for an experimental theater in England called Fun Palace. And the idea was that because it was like avant-garde theater, if the scene demanded like 2 walls and a couch, you could like pull a rope and like flip a lever and those things would appear, like lowered down by these giant cranes that went over the ceiling. And even though this, again, wasn't built, it is a way to think about how we come together by filing planning board applications, sometimes having protests, having lawsuits, having political campaigns to decide about how we manage these life support systems, right? How we get our water, how we educate our children, how we ensure that our air is breathable. And so even though the Fun Palace doesn't exist, maybe we all kind of live in an actually existing Fun Palace. And then that raises questions. How do we talk to each other about this? What constitutes a legitimate explanation for why a certain decision might be made? A lot of people say that planners are less good at communicating than they are at plansplaining. This is my picture of plansplaining. But what is a legitimate idea for building a city? Is it something that comes with flying babies? Is it a kind of like very pale a spirit of city planning that descends from the heavens into the slum below? Is it just people who like to argue about stuff? Is it a true fight against oppression? Like when they released the only ever master plan for New York City, as they were serving dessert for the celebration luncheon, 50 Black Panthers marched in with a really good chant, which was, "Damn the master's plan." Right? See how they flipped it like that? But no matter what, these kinds of issues of how we build, where we put streets and roads, are not things that are easily analyzed by left-wing or right-wing politics, by Democratic or Republican. They're too specific, they're too detailed, I think, to fall into some of those cable news kinds of debates. So I'm not the kind of designer who's going to try to sit here and convince you that through the magic of art and design, you can kind of sprinkle that on the public and have these problems go away. Instead, I feel like I've learned through rough teaching at times that as a designer, I'm just one interest group among a whole set of people who have all kinds of ideas and all kinds of interests about how we should build the towns and the places that we live and work. And that if I'm going to be successful, I kind of have to have an attitude like you're showing up at a party where you don't know anybody at all. And you're just happy to be able to hang on to a conversation with someone that you just walked up to and met and do your best to make friends. And this for me is a larger scene of place politics. So whether it's questions about environmental quality and how we produce our electricity, or questions about how we get around in cars, in robot cars, in buses, this is a larger field that I think that we as a country are increasingly paying attention to because things are turning into cities and people are living closer together all the time. So now I'd like to finish with a story from a place that might seem very far away from here. It's the city where I live now in Newark, New Jersey. And I would simply like to present it as a series of experiments as how we might build with roots in organized communities. So first, has anyone ever been to Newark before? A couple besides the airport? Still? Okay, still a couple hands, good. So if you don't know, it's the most populous city in the most densely populated state in the country, which is New Jersey. It's about 12 miles away from New York City. That's the tip of Manhattan right there. It's 24 square miles, about 275,000 people or so. And the story I'm going to tell you is about the riverfront. And there's a lot of very generic but still true things about the riverfront, which I think does not seem to be as a beautiful place as your riverfront here in Racine. But number one, generic but true thing is that it's the reason that the city is there. And historically, the city came right up to the water's edge. Number two, generic but true thing is that it's been the inheritor of a pretty frightening toxic legacy. So what you see here is the remains of a facility where they produced first DDT before Rachel Carson wrote her Silent Spring book, and that eventually was outlawed. And then they got into the Agent Orange business, which, as you probably know, a chemical weapon used by the United States in war in Vietnam. And it had horrible effects there and horrible effects here where it was produced. Its byproduct was something called dioxin, which doesn't exist in nature, and it's one of the most horrifying carcinogenic compounds that I've ever heard of. And this is now a 10-foot thick concrete cap that is meant to be permanent on that site in the city. This is a partial list. This is about a third of the companies that have been officially listed as potentially responsible for that contamination. And as we speak, there's a huge fight with many, many attorneys and scientists involved about who's going to foot the about $2 billion bill to clean up the mess that's in this river. All right, third, generic but a true thing, is that if you go there as recently as 5 years ago, you would find a lot of what urban planners like me call underutilized property. Now, this wasn't necessarily, and because it's kind of looking like this, it became the backdrop for this, which is the opening credits to The Sopranos. Any Sopranos fans out there? This whole story is about the Newark Promenade, which I know is my dad watches Sopranos. So all of this was not because of lack of planning. In fact, there had been millions of dollars spent on visions and plans from the early 1980s to the early 2000s. Most of them were sponsored by either elected officials or landowners who really wanted to conjure up ambitious visions for what could be done with this land. This is the stack of plans that I was gifted on one of my first days in City Hall. And this is what some of those plans look like. And this is kind of a bird's eye view. Many of them saw the riverfront as a place to make a whole new identity for the city through some pretty exclusionary design tactics. So without going all into it, these are kind of private public spaces, within this new development, et cetera. And the attitude you see here is not an uncommon one. And so about 5 years ago, and I will never cease to give them trouble for it, my friends at the Downtown Business Improvement District put up these banners that said, "Downtown Newark, yours to rediscover," like it's a lost island of Atlantis or something like that. When you walk a half a block further and you see one of the most populated intersections in this entire region, right? So there's some real mismatch of like perceptions and norms and things like that. And this has been also gotten attention from the federal government. And so about 20 years ago, there was this persistent problem of flooding in the more affluent suburbs of the city, so up around here. And the Army Corps was given the mission of figuring out some way of engineering a solution to these floods. And so their idea, being very strong engineers, was to build a 20-mile-long pipe that would relieve the flooding from the suburbs and just take it out to the bay. Now, some of the people proposing some of those plans in Newark heard about this, and they said, oh, well, it can't just go under Newark, like we have to get something out of it. And so they reached an agreement with the Army Corps where the Army Corps would rebuild the edge of the water, the bulkhead, the kind of steel wall there, and in theory, eventually build some public space. So this is what building a bulkhead looks like. Above that bulkhead, because the thing that holds it to the earth is this 40-foot-long screw, the idea for the public space was that you couldn't build above that screw, so that would be the public space, the space where you just couldn't build anything else. And for the last 20 years, they have spent about $60 million building this steel wall with a concrete cap. because the things that you or I might recognize as public space, like a bench or a trash can or a light or even like a ladder to climb out of the river if you accidentally fall in, were put in like a third phase that has not yet been funded, what you see is this, which has become, I think, not just to me, but to many people in the city, a symbol of infrastructure that's not rooted in organized communities. And even though someone might say, oh, this is a real resilience upgrade, your shore is not going to erode and what have you, for us it was a real affront and a real insult that this is how this idea started off. So I just want to conclude with kind of 3 points that were really helpful to us as we tried to muddle through the situation and try to find something worth doing inside of it. Among those plans, there was one that really stuck out because it wasn't kind of a grand real estate vision that seemed very unrealistic based upon the existing market conditions. And it had been done up by a community group that was simply looking for a place to have more park and open space, because they had 50,000 people and about 5 acres of open space for all of them, which was way below your recommended amount. And that kind of signaled to us for the first time that the interest group around the riverfront wasn't monolithic. There actually were different interests already there, and that maybe a way to start was trying to draw them out and kind of seeing what the extent of that was. So rather than another kind of $500 million vision or something, we came up with a whole set of different ideas just to kind of test the waters. Be like, oh, well, who would come out if we had a high school boating program? Is anyone here interested in boating? Oh, who would come to a panel discussion about the Superfund process? And we just tried to think of things, and we set a goal for ourselves of getting 2 cents from 2% of Newarkers. And this was a totally arbitrary, made-up number. It was simply just a way to kind of focus ourselves on the concrete mechanics of testing and building a constituency for this place. So I started off, as I like to do when I don't know anything, hanging out with some local teenagers. So we did things like explore the territory, look at maps, interview real estate developers, environmental activists, make maps of what we found. People were most excited by like a dead bird that we found or some weird boxer shorts. We began to learn stories that I certainly was not told by the mayor when he asked me to look into the riverfront. So for example, a public housing development that had gotten in a big fight with their landlord, the housing authority, who had rented out all of this space between them and the river to a company that stored these shipping containers up to 7 feet tall. And so after a lot of activism and organizing and getting a pretty embarrassing article in the New York Times, they got the housing authority to cease that lease. We also learned about a really long-standing movement in the city and region for environmental justice. And I know you guys have an eco-justice center here that I was excited to read about. But these were people, most of the time, fighting against bad things they didn't want. They didn't want the chicken transfer station. They didn't want the medical waste incinerator. But eventually, some of those people came around to actually having positive visions. Like, we'd like to see a park space near the river where we can just go and kick up our feet and watch the water go by. So the students then came up with some of their own visions that range from things like a factory that makes only the aroma of chocolate, or a roller coaster that goes along the entire edge of the water. And where it kind of stopped being maybe an enjoyable, maybe enriching after-school program and became, I would say, a more publicly useful phenomenon was when the group made this model of the way they thought the riverfront should be in the year 3000. And then the mayor, who's now our senator right here, came and cut a little ribbon on the little model, and this became the city's kickoff about a different type of attention to this place than had been paid up until that time. So the model was installed right outside of where you pay your water bill. And so we thought if only like 5 people a day wandered out of boredom to read about this riverfront and what these kids imagined, that would be some more and different types of attention than the place had gotten for a while. The local news, without asking any of our permissions, took up the kids right after the press conference and took them to the riverfront and made this whole kind of Scooby-Doo-like segment where they were like, these pesky kids have been like causing trouble and looking around, but now City Hall wants to take them up on it. And even though it wasn't exactly true, that as a story to kick off this initiative was way more promising in my mind than some pointy-headed planner has an idea or the mayor made him do it. So we also were really aware, as we tried to build out this discussion, of the segregation of our city, like most American cities. And so we tried to make things that would make it seem like it was a fun and like grown and sexy experience. So we got like a club flyer designer to design this postcard for our first ever public boat tours of the Passaic River, where for $5 you could take your family out on one of these little pontoon boats and hear some talking from people like me about what you're looking at, what it was, what it has been, what it could be, but maybe more importantly, talk to your neighbors. And this was a place where and maybe this is true in these areas too, where if you actually had one person from each of the wards or each of the little towns surrounding the city, people really noticed that, because that was not such a common thing to happen. We also had $100 a ticket boat rides for the upper crust of the town, because those people are important too, right? The people with the capital and the power are important audiences as well. We did these things called walk shops, where you could walk around, see what was there, start to share visions. And this is how we did after 4 years. But again, the point wasn't at all the numbers. It was testing the possibility of having these relationships around a place, that enough people would see it worthwhile of attention that something would have a chance of happening. All right, the second thing is to cultivate accountable development. And this is a quick one. It has to do with zoning. I don't want to put anyone to sleep. But basically, there were not really updated rules for how you could build in this space. And previous planners had kind of colored in the entire 5-mile-long riverfront, saying that will be the riverfront district, and people will do like riverfront things. And if you want to know more details, like ask us sometime later. And so this became the challenge of how do you have a conversation about a technical and complex thing like zoning with all kinds of people. So all kinds of knowledge and experience and opinions can find their way into that very code writing technical process. So we tried to boil down all the possible questions into 24 pretty basic questions about what kind of buildings should be allowed, how big those buildings might be, whether there needed to be public spaces or things like that, how the upland areas of the city could be connected to this area that touches the water. We made a set of these workbooks that were designed not just to do by yourself, but for the basic civic unit of society in our city, which is like the block club, the neighborhood association, the community of worship, the mosque, the church. We talked about how zoning works in the most basic ways, back to some of those stories about when we first had rules for what you could build. And we began to talk about different scenarios, not just so much so that people could choose their favorite, but that we could really start to chew over together the pros and cons and develop these kind of shared understandings of what the opportunities might be and why we would actually take a certain type of action. Probably the most exciting part of this piece of the work for me was the day when this document, the first Newark citywide citizen statement on riverfront development, showed up at City Hall. And all of my colleagues were all like at Twitter and like, oh my goodness, this is going to be a problem, there's going to be fighting and whatever. But I think for me and my colleagues, it really represented the emergence of a new voice on the scene about who was going to have a say about this important place for the city. And eventually there was zoning passed. There were some lawsuits about the zoning. One property owner out of 99 didn't want the public going through their property, but that's another story. The final thing I'll mention that was really important for us was hitching imagination to administration. Now, a lot of this activity I've shown is about just kind of disarming people, beginning to think almost in like a childlike way about the places that we inhabit and what they look like and what they can be. But all of that can be really false promises unless it's connected to a really nuts and bolts understanding of budgets and timelines and what it takes to really get something done. And so we knew that people had been fighting for 25 years for something to happen on the riverfront. So it was really important that even if it was the size of a postage stamp, that there be a physical place as quickly as possible that people could point to and say, our work paid off in that. And so again, we began with that example of infrastructure not rooted in an organized community and tried to do it differently. After the boat tours and the walk shops, sometimes we'd have 100 people show up, which was a whole lot, at City Hall on a weeknight to talk about what this place could be and what it could look like. We actually moved the situation of the first phase from downtown, where, again, a lot of the landowners had been pushing for it, although without success for about 20 years, to the neighborhood where all this organizing had happened, where they had demonstrated that there was people energy behind making something happen. We felt that building in the other place, you ran the risk of just having a beautiful park with maybe some people there during lunch, but otherwise abandoned. So eventually we went from a place that looked like this The high school students came back and made this construction sign, again, trying to kind of document, like in simple drawings, what that might look like. And eventually we were able to gather up about $25 million of private and public investment to build out about 15 of the city's first ever riverfront parks. So I'll just show you quickly what it looks like. It has an orange boardwalk. You might be like, why in the world is the boardwalk orange? The first reason was it didn't have to be wood colored because we were not going to mess with tropical hardwood, if you have any experience with conflicts around that. But why is it orange? After that, well, the mayor's favorite tie is orange. There's Agent Orange, of course. There's some of the city's favorite high schools whose color is orange. Later on, when we had free public yoga classes there, the yoga instructor said, oh, you must have known that the chakra associated with water and creativity is orange, and so on and so forth. And of course, other people began to use that. We wanted to make a place where kind of the things that people already wanted to do could be possible, but in a slightly new and different way. It also opened up views onto the city that were, for the first time, you really could see the city's skyline from within the city itself. And maybe most important of all, a lot of people who had been in that 25-year fight said, we don't want people to come to a nice new park and just say, oh, this is so beautiful, and forget about all the work and struggle that went into it. So we want the park to tell its own story of creation. So as you come there, you start to first see these strange characters like mules and things and factories on the rail. There's both poetry by Langston Hughes as well as a full accounting of where all the money came from, not just the private individuals who were generous, but things like the New Jersey Hazardous Discharge Site Remediation Fund, institutional arrangements that we've made to try to clean up some of our own messes. When you go down to the river, you see these water jet cut railings that start to explain what you're looking at. Like this one says, what's that concrete platform behind here? And then it says, well, to understand that, you have to understand a little bit about sewers and the history of sewers. Like, once upon a time, there were no sewers. That caused some problems. So then they built some sewers, which solved some of the problems, but then the river became so stinky that you couldn't sleep with your window open at night. So then they built the sewage treatment plant to take some of the nastiness out of the water before it went back in, which works pretty good, except when it rains and then it overflows, and that's a whole nother problem. And so here's some of the things that people do today to try to get the rainwater to go into the earth and things instead of the sewer system. And so these go into industrial archaeology, into the fish and plants you might see, although some say, like this crab, do not catch me or eat me, I am poisonous. Kids come down and do rubbings on them, and it becomes a place to kind of transmit these stories as they get told and retold and passed down to different generations. Sometimes people take the power into their own hands and add their own stories. This one was in 3 languages, Portuguese, Spanish, and English, which was pretty impressive. There were these narrative logs that went into things like the former contamination of the site. It was a smelting plant. And so this dug up some stories about workers that would catch on fire and have to run into the river, or people who were caught embezzling gold chunks, or when the workers went on strike because they had outrageous working conditions and wages. Some of the more difficult signs to do were living memories, like people who had fought to preserve one of the neighborhood parks from becoming a minor league baseball stadium. So we would do the drawing and show it to them, and they'd be like, oh, it's all right, but my hair didn't look anything like that in 1976. So we'd bring it back and go back and forth. And again, these become places where people come together to point at how this environment was the outcome of their struggles, how the city relates to the region around it. And then the park becomes a place to really party and to show off the spirit and the dynamic activities of the spot. So whether it's the Malcolm X Shabazz marching band leading to the Walk to the Water every single year, or people coming in to dance or to boat or to do different types of ceremonies. I really like these furry pants from Ecuador. People bring their own typefaces and stylistic cultures to the park. It was the first public boat dock in the city in 100 years. It's been so amazing in Wisconsin to see so many people enjoying boats. It's super inspirational. Dance parties, on Saturday night, first baptisms on Sunday morning. And of course, this took all kinds of organizations coming together, right, to see that bigger picture that you all have been talking about here in Racine and really to try to make that happen. This is a recruitment poster that we just did that tries to break down the complex environment that the river lives in, and importantly, tries to take this traditional view of the city that always looks to the east, to see Manhattan at the top and tries to flip that around so you can actually see all of the treasures that lay around the river's edge. Of course, there's challenges coming. We had Superstorm Sandy out east that changed all kinds of preconceptions, that led to all other kinds of bad Army Corps ideas, although I have many beloved friends in the Army Corps. It led to renewed worries about displacement and gentrification in the city in terms of what this would mean. It led to new challenges around what the housing mix and who would be allowed to live near the river. And so to conclude, even with these challenges, we really hope that this kind of party, where these diversity of people and interest groups come together, is what we need to face those challenges, to develop new capacities as a group and a society to make the places that we want. Just so you know, these were the kind of parties that it took to make all those projects happen that I just showed. I'm happy to post this up because I know you can't read it now. And so the things that I'm excited to talk about during the hospitality are things like, how does Greater Racine talk to itself about how it builds itself and what it wants to be? And what is Racine-ness? You know, is it like these interesting Kringle, it's called? You know, is it that? Is it like the #1 winning Mexican restaurant? Is it fish fry? I've learned a lot about fish fry in Milwaukee and here. Because at the end of the day, I'm excited to hear about who has to be at your party in order for you to build the region that you want. So thank you very much.
You want to grab a seat?
Sure.
Wow, that was fascinating, wasn't it? Just two very interesting, different but similar presentations. So I'm really interested to hear what questions you all have for our fantastic speakers. I do want to mention, it's kind of funny given the social norms discussion, that we are recording this presentation, this event this evening, excuse me, and we are streaming it on our Facebook Live. So in terms of norms, the questions that you ask will live on forever, and the comments you make. So, but in that being said, I want you to really ask the questions that you're thinking about, and want to open it up now to anyone that has one. Hopefully I didn't scare anyone away. Okay, Nick, in the back, please wait until a microphone comes. Great.
So my question is for, was it Damon?
Yeah.
Damon, that was excellent presentations from both of you. Thank you so much for coming to Racine. I just wanted to ask you, you glossed past this kind of quickly, but Racine is, you may or may not know, like, we think we will be seeing incredible economic development over the next couple of years at a scale that we've never seen before. And something that I'm very concerned about, and that a lot of people are very concerned about in the wake of that, is the gentrification that inevitably in communities seems to come with that. I'm interested in hearing you talk about a little bit more. You just brought it up in like a quick snippet, but if you could elaborate on when you experienced those issues and how you all dealt with them in Newark, I'd be really interested in hearing that.
Sure. Well, I wish that I had a silver bullet to sell you. You know, I think that we're living in a really interesting moment. I have a friend who puts together kind of a weekly clippings email of all of the towns that are having discussions around things like community benefits agreements. This all might sound like jargon to people. Things like inclusionary zoning. And beyond all the jargon that I think that those words carry with them are these fundamental questions about how are we going to make decisions about the places that we live. And especially when we're talking about economics, it is really complicated in this country, right? Because again, we have these twin threads of really valuing private property and the prerogatives of it, but also really valuing group decision-making in some form or another, and democracy. And so, these things like community benefit agreements are, for example, where a community, to be defined, and it's defined in many different ways, executes a legally binding agreement with a real estate development team that says, as part of building this building or expanding this campus, we have the following agreements in terms of who's going to be working on these jobs, whether they're union or not, what kind of local participation there are, what kind of community access might be available to these kinds of facilities. For something like inclusionary zoning, and this is a big drama now on the East Coast because it's in effect in a mandatory way in New York City for the first time. It basically says if you build a building in a certain part of the city, by law, there's no options involved, you have to include a certain number of apartments or units that are affordable to people making a certain kind of income. And these things are tough and complicated, but I definitely have a lot of faith that there's so much to learn from different communities talking to each other as they navigate these kind of new waters, right? I mean, the story of my lifetime, born in 1975, was cities and disinvestment, right? Cities and markets that didn't seem to be producing the goods that people wanted. And so in the last 15 or 20 years, in some places at least, where you've seen new kind of waves of investment, it's raised a whole new set of questions, just like you put out there.
Other questions? Wow. Yes, up front. Let's just wait for the microphone so everyone can hear your question.
So I had two actually, but to follow up on Nick's question, so how do we change the narrative? How do we find those social references within our community who can say, this isn't how we view ourselves, or this isn't how we plan to make decisions, or this isn't what we fear. We have heart, we have social justice, we have a belief in the freedom and the equality of all people who live in our city. And we don't believe that large corporations have the ability to make those decisions for us. How do we find those social norms? And then, it might be just a tweaky question. When you did your diagrams, Betsy, there were sometimes these outliers. What were those? So those were the two things that, well, some of the two things were
Great.
That's a really wonderful question. I think, Damon, you probably have something to say about that too. And I loved in your presentation how you said that the first people who you like to talk to are the local teenagers. And I think that that's one thing that we've thought about in our work in a very bounded community in schools. The reason that we were so interested in building these networks, trying really to survey young people to find out what their networks were. We didn't want to look for the imprint of social media networks. We really wanted to ask them, and we had the hunch, and I think it was borne out, that we would find people who we hadn't thought of. And one thing I didn't tell you about is that, no ideas are really my own. All of these ideas have come before me, and there's a lot of programming out there, for example, in communities and with young people, in which people try to find opinion leaders. Just what we had observed was that, for example, for schools, a lot of that programming, you go to the teachers and maybe the vice principal and ask who are the kids who should be involved. And teachers and vice principals know a lot about the students in their schools. It's just that they have a particular view. And so we had actually worked with some of those programs before, and we were just curious who would we find if we asked the young people themselves. And what we actually did in our big project that I told you about was we asked teachers at the same time to predict who they thought would be influential students. And it turns out that their predictions of who students would nominate, they only overlapped by about 25%. And they overlap in kind of predictable ways. If you think about the job of a teacher, the people who they were noticing are the people who stand out in a classroom. They were really great students and really difficult students. And so teachers could recognize that, students who are difficult can also be influential. Those are the students who don't actually get nominated for these peer leadership programs. But if you start to change the questions you ask, you get different nominations. So we started changing those questions by simply saying, well, who do you think is influential, not who should be a peer leader, right? So that starts to change, but that was still only 25%. So, so for us, we talk to the whole, school, but we're thinking about this too. It's the right question to ask. How can we do this at scale? You can't survey everyone, so who do you go to? And I think that, asking lots of different people, who are they paying attention to? But also really purposefully going to the people in your community who don't get asked a lot, like young people. I mean, people really don't often talk to young people about their communities. I think is a really good rule for a way to start and follow from there. And yes, in every community there are people who are more isolated, and you saw that in the figures themselves, people who aren't connected to that many others, and so so that's what you were seeing in those figures. Yeah. Did you want to talk about that too? How did you find
have
people?
Like a tiny footnote. It's kind of, as I've gotten older, it's kind of amazing how many groups you meet who are amazing at expressing their best intentions. Yet when it's time to have a discussion about it, there's like no one new in the room who hasn't been there already for like 20 plus years. And I guess one thing that I've learned, working in these bureaucracies and organizations, is that unless you have new people at the table, you're probably going to have that same conversation again and the same frustrations at the end of it. And so constantly asking that question of like, well, who's not here that like really should be here? Mm-hmm. And why didn't they want to come here? Is it because they didn't know about it, or because they were like, oh, that's going to be a bunch of those people? And like I've had that experience before. As a designer, I feel like I have a very like clear motivation in that I'm convinced that the most interesting designs are only going to come out of these interesting mixes and matches that you only have, right, in places where people come together. Mm-hmm. So, I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense.
And sorry, can I draw out one more thing? Yeah. I think that you just mentioned is that it's a long game to think about it that way. It's iterative. You can keep returning and asking more people, and high schools and middle schools are actually a great example of this. Even within one session, we were asking students who were participating in this anti-conflict program one time to put on an assembly for the rest of the school. And you could watch the students who felt like maybe they had the most reputation to lose. They didn't go on stage at first. They sort of waited, and they watched what the reception was from the audience. And then by the end, when they saw it was okay, they went on stage. And it was sort of a metaphor for how you do this kind of community organizing, is that it's true, not everybody is going to think it's for them. And they might worry about, being affiliated with certain types of movements, and they want to test the waters and see what it's like. And so, when you think about that kind of community consultation and bringing people on board, you can think about it as a long game, not just a one-shot consultation.
Great. Yes, Megan.
So, thank you for coming. I really enjoyed your study of the social reference or the leaders. But my question was, did you do any deeper studying into the personality traits of these leaders? Were they high in like extroversion or openness or assertiveness? And then after that, what is their responsibility? Because I can see that being very positive, but then I can see that, kind of going negative. Maybe they monopolize a conversation. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. The one short answer is that we didn't do sort of leadership or personality profiles of them. I get asked that question a lot because, of course, people are saying, all right, so how should I use that to go and look in my own community? I would guess, just from having worked with these students and interview them, we spent long hours doing qualitative interviews. I would say yes, they're usually more socially skilled, but they come from all over the network. So they some of them are people getting a lot of attention in pockets of the community or network that aren't particularly outgoing. So you could imagine that some of these social reference are like the people who get the most attention in like the math club, right? So you wouldn't necessarily pick them out as a charismatic leader, and yet within their area of the community, they're the ones who are the leaders. So it's all on a relative scale. So I would say these kinds of methods usually do pick up the very charismatic, widely known people, but also people who other people are paying attention to. So I keep going back to this idea of in various places in your community, who are people watching? Who do people notice? Who do people try to spend time with and be around? And we've sort of built up a profile of who those people are just by asking that question. Yeah.
Anything you'd like to add onto that?
I'm good for now.
Okay.
Thanks.
Great. One last question. Oh, we have two more. Okay, start over there.
How do you each see being a MacArthur Fellow impacting on your life, professionally, personally, financially or non-financially?
Do you want to go first?
I mean, it definitely was one of the most surprising things that ever happened to me. And, I think in a lucky way, I had a lot of like, why me feelings, in the sense that, I feel like I could look to my left and be like, what about like Sister Carol? Like, she's been like doing such amazing work for 40 years, or, what about this other person? And so I feel like it's been an amazing kind of kick in the pants to think about, a larger community of practitioners, right? There's many architects and landscape architects and designers and planners who are interested in these questions, both like going back in time and, thankfully with us here today. And so, I feel like, learning about Betsy's research, maybe that, that helps me, think about that question of like, how do you actually turn something that's like so amazing and so surprising around, so that, it's both helpful for you, obviously, but it really is that recognition of a broader endeavor.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of that. It was an enormous surprise, and I experienced it during a time of my life when I was struggling a little bit, actually, to be honest. I had been going through a hard period personally, and it hit me at that moment, and it was really personally meaningful for me, actually. And professionally, I felt, a great honor and a sense of responsibility to keep going. But it was also very inspiring. Actually, just learning about your work, and my favorite moment of that day actually was looking at the videos of everyone else. I just thought like, oh my gosh, what company. And I did see connections, and I did see points of inspiration, but also just admiration, and that felt just incredibly uplifting, really. So, yeah.
Okay, one last question. Bill?
Yeah, Damon, I was just going to ask,
Can you wait for the microphone? Thanks.
can you talk about the health of the Passaic River, and how does Newark deal with the city across the river trying to regulate the river, keep it clean or whatever, clean it up?
Yeah. Again, I feel like I'm at risk of putting people to sleep if I want to like list off like the 4 federal agencies that have to like sign off on things, where even sometimes the Army Corps wanted to do really nice ecological things, like build a restored wetland, but then Fish and Wildlife would say, like, no, that's an attractive nuisance because wildlife will go there to die. But in terms of the health of the river, I mean, one of the big headlines, really is that in an amazing way, even under the most adverse of conditions, that these natural systems, do persist. And so to take, a 7-year-old, who grew up in Newark or a surrounding town on that boat, and then to see a white egret that's like 5.5 feet tall is like absolutely mind-blowing, right? And to know then that egret is not there, just to hang out, it's there because like there's fish, in the water. And so having that message of resilience, not just of the natural system, but of the many people in the city and surrounding towns that have fought for this to be different than it is I feel like one of the most important things. And I feel like, your work is really inspiring in that aspect, in terms of the ability of these things to start to tweak these social systems that we've set up that are so present, if invisible. The regional question there is also a big one. I mean, Newark New Jersey has the highest number of municipalities per capita, like over 500 cities, towns, villages within our state of 8 million people. And so it's, the same kind of discussions I know that are happening here about sharing services and consolidating districts are active there, but I think as slow and painful as there are anywhere else. And the difficulty of, again, rearranging these systems that I've provided, police, fire departments, like sewage treatment. So, I remember once, I took the county executive because I was trying to convince him of something, and the river is the county line. And I was talking to him about the other side of the river, and he was like looking at me confused, and he was like, "Oh, you mean all the way over there in Hudson County?" And that really, laid out how difficult and how much work and how much of a long haul it was going to be to even change these maps of even the most informed and powerful people, in the space.
Well, please join me in giving one final round of applause. So now we have the opportunity to ask Betsy and Damon more questions and talk about these ideas and new thinking potentially over at our hospitality at Wingspread. So please try not to just come up and ask questions here, but to please go over to hospitality and grab something to eat, something to drink, and we'll see you over there. So thank you.
You were awesome. That was awesome. Right back at you.